The internet is crack. You try to go, but we all know you'll be back because the internet is crack.
The Internet is Crack, the show that asks the question, can we coexist with our creation?
Hello, I'm Seth Camillo.
And I am Caroline Risberg, and we are The Internet is Crack by addicts for addicts.
And today we are very lucky to have Professor Ryan Jenkins. He is an associate professor of philosophy at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Emerging Science Group. He specializes in the ethics of emerging technologies, including AI, autonomous weapons, and self-driving cars. His work explores how technology shapes moral responsibility and how society can ensure new systems serve the public's good. He writes widely for both academic journals and major outlets like the Washington Post, Slate, and Forbes. Thank you, Professor Jenkins, for joining us. We are very lucky to have you.
It's a huge pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to start our first question. So just to go down from the basic, what first drew you to studying the ethics of emerging technology?
So I was always interested, my parents raised me to make sure that I was having a positive impact on the world. And when I was in high school and very introspective, I formulated this kind of theory of the good life, which was using my skills and talents to make the world a better place or leave it a better place than I found it. And I remember having these kind of tense, antagonistic conversations with my parents because one of my original career aspirations was graphic design. And I remember my mom grilling me like, is that really the best thing that you can do for the world? And I thought, well, companies that I care about they need billboards and brochures and things too. But then as I went on, there was a long and tumultuous journey in undergrad from graphic design finally into philosophy. So it was a very tumultuous path from graphic design into philosophy. But, making that transition into philosophy, a lot of those concerns are just exacerbated because philosophy has such a reputation for being detached and abstract and divorced from the concerns of real people in the real world. But I became interested in military ethics towards the end of my undergraduate career. And the more that I learned about the ethics of armed conflict and the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law, the more it became clear that here was a place where the arguments and the reflections of philosophers had a concrete impact on making the world more humane. And that's just clear as day in black and white. If you read the arguments of philosophers from the 15, 16, 1700s or back even further than that, and you hold up next to it things like the Geneva Convention, there's a not coincidental significant overlap between those. And so that made me very enthusiastic. And that was very, very reassuring for me. Here was a place where philosophy is not just abstract, it's actually working to make the world a more humane place. And using one of my favorite definitions of philosophy, which comes from Epicurus, that philosophy is the use of reason and argument to improve human life. And so I like to think that I fall into that kind of tradition.
So that's wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and so it's kind of a roundabout way, but ultimately the kinds of projects I ended up working on in military ethics were military technologies, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons or killer robots, and so on. And so I kind of stepped from there back into pure emerging ethics, just AI and robotics, and not in the military domain specifically. So it's a roundabout path, but that kind of ties together my undergrad history.
Do you think that autonomous weapons can ever be morally acceptable? Do you think they should be banned outright? And are they just a war crime waiting to happen? You know?
Yeah, I mean, my view on this has evolved quite a bit. And I used to think, well, let me start by saying, like most people, I think, I have a very strong intuitive reaction, a very strong immediate revulsion, a sense of abhorrence when I think about something like an autonomous weapon. But I've worked for 10 or 15 years. This has been maybe the single most fertile area of my research. And I've I'm yet to encounter an argument that can justify that intuition. So I'm not sure. I'm conflicted in the way that I feel about it, in the way that I think about it. And I'll say one thing. I think that our conversation might be a little bit more productive if we decompose what we
Okay.
think of as an autonomous weapon. So, we think about the Terminator
Yes.
going on like a,
My
a, a
favorite
killing spree,
subject.
right? And that's
Yeah.
that's what a lot of people think of. Um,
Yeah.
and if you're thinking about robots that select and engage human targets without direct human oversight, I mean,
Yeah.
that's obviously very, very problematic. I think that there are places where they could be justifiably used for sure. Um, and I think that there are ways that you can use autonomy in a military context that's less problematic, even if it's part of what we call the kill chain. So, what we mean by an autonomous weapon, we have to be really clear about that. We have to be really clear where AI is contributing to some lethal action or some kinetic action. And in a lot of
Mm.
those cases, I think we find them relatively unproblematic, or at least much less problematic than, Terminator 2 Judgment Day.
Yeah, I've heard even now, I could be wrong, that they are developing drones where because jamming is so prevalent that they are now have drones when they become jammed, their second option is to then autonomously find a target. So this isn't just theory, it's starting to be reality.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and um yeah, as a non-philosopher, as a person who doesn't have the expertise you have, it strikes me as just chillingly frightening on numerous levels, which I'll let you expand on and we can talk about it. But that's my gut reaction, as you said,
Right,
is
right.
most people's gut reaction.
Yeah, and it's mine too, and it's still mine. And if I could flip a switch and guarantee that they never saw the light of day, I'd probably flip that switch. But I don't think it's that simple. I mean, for one thing, I think the horse is already out of the barn. So
Yeah.
they're in, depending on what we mean by an autonomous weapon, there are weapons with all kinds of levels of autonomy in use already on the battlefield. And and when we dig into those, some of those seem less problematic. But precisely what you mentioned is that there's so much jamming, so much electronic warfare and interference that you can't reliably control a drone as far as you used to be able to. And one countermeasure is to use fiber optic cable. This is something
Yep.
that we see in Ukraine. So you can string a couple miles of fiber optics onto the back
Yeah.
of a drone, which is just astonishing when you think about it.
Mm.
Yeah.
But another response is to allow the weapon to operate even if its connection to its controller is severed. And so that's exactly what you mentioned. We can't let there might be some missions that are so important that we can't risk compromising them or abandoning them in a denied environment, an environment where we don't have clear communications. And that goes for the battlefield in Ukraine, where jamming is so common, but it also goes for other environments like underwater, where command and control might be very difficult, or where
Mm,
communications links are very difficult to
mm,
maintain, and where stealth is very important.
mhm,
In fact, anytime stealth is important, you don't want to be transmitting or receiving to some object that you're trying to conceal.
mhm,
So there's many places where autonomy makes a lot of sense, and there's many places around the edges where it seems less problematic. And I can give you some examples rather than just sort of
Yeah.
waving, like brushing all these concerns away with my hand and saying, it's people
Yeah,
people
no,
get
please
worked up
do.
about it.
Yeah.
So one example is let's take something like the war in Ukraine. I mean, there are drones now that can find a target and basically fix on a target. They can lock onto a target, and the target could be a tank, let's say, or a personnel carrier. And if the connection with the controller is severed, they're smart enough. We should put smart in air quotes. They're
Yeah.
terrifying enough, or they're smart enough, however you
Yeah.
want to put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're smart enough to be able to use computer vision and other kinds of machine learning models to track that target and engage that target over the last couple hundred feet. When and where the use of autonomy is acceptable is a nuanced question.
We've always thought about the doomsday, rule, where if we're fired upon, even if America is flattened, we automatically respond autonomously. So that's kind of maybe the first example of the idea, at least, that would hit the population at large about autonomous weapons. And I know that I always used to think as a kid, well, if we're all dead, why should we kill everybody else? I mean, that's a deep question in and of itself, I guess.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I went through a phase last year where I consumed a lot of nuclear apocalypse movies, and there's a great line in one of them where someone in the army is chastising someone in the executive branch who wants to order an all-out retaliatory strike, and he says something like, nuclear war is not the kind of war where you just add up the number of people that died and see who wins. I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of people, and the numbers are just incomprehensible, and the suffering is incalculable at that point. So, as you put it, it's kind of silly. I mean, it really is this ruthless vengeance from beyond the grave, and you have to ask, what good does that do humanity? On the other
Right.
hand, if you're relying on deterrence to keep yourself safe, then the deterrent threat has to be a plausible threat. And you can't
Mhm.
just sort of nod and wink that maybe something bad will happen if your enemies aggress against you.
I mean, I'm thinking, like, if with all of this, like, if let's say that let's say America is very powerful in the technology now and all this, or other countries are. I mean, isn't it? I mean, who should be in charge? I always have heard, like, from military people that I've known before, who said, "Oh, this is good. America can be anywhere in the world within certain amount of hours. The Navy, the Air Force, whatever it is." But then I'm thinking, who all around the world, everybody don't love America, and want them to be the big brother. And where, like, when all this technology comes in and the way they can target, I don't know. I guess I'm I guess what I'm trying to ask is, who who should decide? I mean, how do you, in this? Who should be the big powerful? Who says that we are better in America than in other countries when it comes to, if that makes sense?
Right. Well, I think it absolutely makes sense. And I think this is, again, you're throwing me all the hardball questions here.
Sorry.
Um, no, it's fine. These are big questions. They're important questions as we get further into the 21st century, and they're questions that we're not going to be able to escape, just as you said, because the technology is accelerating at the same time that geopolitical tensions and the drivers of those tensions, the more fundamental drivers of those tensions, are also accelerating. So, what do we think about this? Well, one thing that I should have said at the end of my previous answer about the doomsday device is that we actually have achieved an agreement recently with China not to use artificial intelligence for nuclear command and control. So we
Okay.
agreed that we wouldn't delegate the choice of launching nuclear weapons to an AI system. That's good. Now, that's common sense. That's I would think, the lowest hanging fruit that we have to deal with here. But it's also encouraging that you can build momentum with a small win like this. And then maybe after this, maybe it's launching other kinds of weapons, or maybe it's launching other kinds of countermeasures or counterattacks. And we can start to draw some boundaries or draw some lines that everyone in the world can agree are sensible, that it would work in no one's interest, right? The risk is simply too great to put these decisions in the hands of a machine that
Right.
might be reliable, but might only be 99.9% reliable. And we've got another important thing to realize is that the history of nuclear weapons is littered with many, many close calls. So that rather than thinking that mutually assured destruction worked wonders, I think the more reasonable conclusion is that we are lucky that we escaped the Cold War without accidentally triggering a nuclear standoff.
Well, I remember as a 16-year-old walking with my father saying something like, "Oh, nuclear war will never happen." My dad's a mathematician, and I said, "Oh, we've already survived, whatever it was, 40, 50 years, and nothing's happened." And he said, "Do you realize what a small sample size that is?" You know?
Yeah, yeah.
And but I would like to steer it AI versus, I know I may be saying this wrong, but eh, some Native American tribe, I believe, just touching your enemy, not even killing them, gave you strength. And the idea that in order to dispatch of your enemy, you have to see them and
Oh.
watch somebody die, versus completely outsourcing to the point
Mm.
where it almost seems like a FIFA, match. What are we gonna do? Our robots versus your robots, and we'll see what happens? I mean, that's where it feels like it's headed, and that doesn't seem like how world events or lives should be lost or saved.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a real concern that each new tool that renders war sanitary, we think. I mean, that's an
Yes,
odd word to use, but I think that it's appropriate.
I do
Um,
too.
there's a long history in warfare of increasing the distance between the warfighter and their adversary. And you can go all the way back to longbows if you want, or you can go back further
Yeah.
than that, catapults and Greek fire and so on.
Yeah.
And tomahawk missiles and long range artillery. And you know, for all of these weapons, you might think that drones and artificial intelligence are just a natural evolutionary step.
Mhm.
However, I think that can be true, but that also elides the moral question of whether the step is a permissible one to take. Even if it seems like a difference in degree, there might be real principled reasons why we don't want to go that far, why we don't want to take that one more additional step. And
Mm.
I think that there are a couple reasons there. One is that if we delegate too much of the oversight and the governance to AI, then we start to increase the risk dramatically, I think. The systems
Yeah.
move so quickly. There's a risk, like we have flash crashes on the stock market. There's a risk of a flash conflict or kind of unexpected um, escalatory dynamics between AI systems that might be interacting. And I
Yeah.
think
Mm.
that's a real worry. And that's not the kind of worry that you would see if you have artillery companies firing at each other. There's still human beings involved there,
Yes.
and they can understand and explain why they're doing what they're doing. Um, and there's another concern is what we sometimes call the threshold objection, which is that making warfare easier, making it less costly in a couple different senses, is likely to make it more common. Just like with any other good on the market, when the price drops, the demand increases. And there's lots of times in our history where we've been reluctant to wage a war because the costs were so high. And when those costs fall, um, then it makes those conflicts more likely. It makes them easier to palate. If we have a decrease in the cost in terms of lives and treasure, then it can make those conflicts easier to sell to the public, for example. Bill Clinton said that one of the greatest regrets of his presidency, among presumably many others, was that he failed to intervene in the Rwandan genocide. And here's a genocide where 800,000 people were killed in the span of a few weeks, and many of them, or most of them, with things like machetes.
Yeah.
And it seems in retrospect like that would have been a relatively easy conflict to intervene in, especially with the kinds of tools that we have nowadays. I think this was Obama's thinking in going into Libya, which was to say, we're not going to put boots on the ground, but we have a less risky method of trying to prevent a genocide here from taking place, or a mass
Mm.
casualty of a government turning on its own citizens and rooting them out and killing them. And we could do that with drones. We had drones available, which Clinton did not have available in the early 90s. And so that war was much easier to sell to the American people. It costs some amount of money to keep the drones airborne, and of course, missiles cost money, but you're not endangering any American lives that way.
Right.
So it's complicated. On the one hand, it's likely, I think it's the plausible conclusion that more war in general is going to make the world worse. Although at the same time, it bears pointing out that there are some wars that we should fight, but we
Right.
don't, because the costs seem too high. So in the grand scheme of things, when all the dust settles, I tend to think that more war in general is going to be more unjust war. And so lowering the cost of war with new tools, whether they be drones or other kinds of long distance weapons, or whether they be AI, I think in general it's probably going to lead to a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of mutual suspicion and distrust, and
Mm.
probably more unjust killing on the whole.
So, do you think there will be more, what do you call it, casualties, like, or more when they're going in targets, so they only get to certain bunkers or whatever you call it? Do you think this is going to spare more innocent people's life in those kind of wars, or do you think it doesn't matter? It's just going to be more wars.
It's not obvious. I mean, like I said, we like to think that the tools are making war more sanitary and
Mm-hmm.
more discriminate, that we're doing a better job of attacking only those people who are legitimate targets and sparing the rest. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there's plenty of evidence from the headlines this week, or probably this morning, of
Yes.
armies that
Yes.
deliberately attack civilians, and
Yes.
the calculus remains the same. So, for example, Ukraine can't protect every square inch of its territory with its anti-air systems. They have to make
Mm.
choices about what they protect, and Russia just makes those choices very costly by deliberately targeting civilian centers, which
Ugh.
puts Ukraine in a position of having to decide whether they protect their cities or whether they protect their troop concentrations and their military installations.
Oh.
And that's the case even though, Russia's sending drones that, in theory, could be a lot more accurate. They're just adopting a separate kind of strategy, and it's a strategy that's existed for hundreds of years in the nature of warfare. So I think at the very least, we should dispense with the idea that the history of warfare is one clean line that we can draw, or one single thread that we can draw. And I think that we should definitely dispense with the idea that our salvation lies in some new kind of robot, or some new chemical, or some new computer model.
Well, I think that's
Mm.
very interesting, and I also I want to talk about who's controlling these things, and increasingly, at least, well, you're the expert on this, but from my point of view, there's a lot of tech billionaires involved, and maybe actually the history of warfare is governed a lot by, maybe they weren't technically billionaires, but adjusted for inflation were billionaires. That, what do you think about these, like Peter Thiel and all these people who are non-governmental actors, but have an enormous impact on this artificial intelligence that's being used in conflict and will be used in future conflicts?
So I don't know. It's news to me, or maybe I'd have to think harder about in the history of warfare, sort of rich and powerful, pulling the strings. I guess now that I say it out loud, it doesn't sound outlandish. But on the scale that we have today and the visibility that we have today, the kind of people that you mentioned, and there's a lot of Silicon Valley unicorns that are catering to the defense and security and policing spaces,
Hmm.
and 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been almost unimaginable. 10 years ago, you have people at Google and Amazon staging walkouts because they don't want to take a contract from the Pentagon that's something as benign
That's
as
right.
cloud storage, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's
but
right.
but nowadays, we have a much closer cozying up between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I mean, I think it's the good old-fashioned profit motive, probably. There's billions of dollars to be spent and billions of dollars to be earned, working with the government. If you trust the values and the operations of the United States military, then it's probably a no-brainer. And if you read the writing on the wall that people who loudly criticize the government nowadays are putting their revenues in danger, I think. And
Yes.
whether that's universities or whether that's private companies, um, that's not news to anyone. I don't think that's listening either. So I think there's a confluence of a couple things going on here that's motivating this closer integration. I think these questions are probably inseparable from larger questions more broadly about the moral character of the United States military. And
Hmm.
I imagine that you could answer both of these questions with one answer. So, do you think that the United States military is, in general or almost all of the time, a morally just institution? And then, secondly, do you think Silicon Valley should work with them? The answers that people give to those questions, I think, are going to be very closely related. I imagine that they would rise and fall together, even if I don't have any empirical survey data
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think, yeah, I think that's probably right. And so for folks like me, um, I've I've had a lot of um, interaction with folks in the Department of Defense. I currently have a grant project
Um,
with them to try to triage the risk of AI systems, to understand which military AI systems might be high or low risk and which ones merit the highest level of scrutiny.
Oh, wow. Tell us about that
hmm.
if you
Yeah.
can.
Sure, sure. Um, and just to finish that thought, and then I'm happy
Yeah.
to circle back to that. So just to finish that thought, the DoD is the largest bureaucracy in the world. It's something like 6 million people. And so we also have to be very wary of painting with a broad brush. There's a lot of great work that goes on in the responsible AI division of the Department
Mm,
of Defense. And the people that I've worked with are very earnest and upstanding and care very much, not just
mm,
about winning America's wars, but about doing it in a way that's consistent with America's values. Because why the hell else are we doing it if we're not trying to promote and defend the American way of life, which we must think is a morally justified one?
Yes.
right. Right.
So
Yes.
they're very complicated. I hesitate. I sort of shrink from answering questions like that with a broad brush. And maybe that's the philosopher in me too that likes to draw these distinctions and point out the nuance. But I think that's important as we get into these discussions.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so some colleagues and I have a project with the Department of Defense, which works to very quickly triage the riskiness of AI systems. And the idea is that the DoD has hundreds of AI projects that it's exploring, or pilots that are underway in various stages of development and deployment. And they have way too many systems for any single team to try to oversee or to examine. And so they came to us. There's two of us at Cal Poly, and the PI is at Sonoma State University. And they asked us to study the biggest drivers of risk in AI systems in the military context and develop a system that can very quickly identify those risks if you know something about the nature of the system, how it's going to be deployed, and what its mission profile is going to be. And so this takes into account things like whether it's deployed for lethal decision making or not. And it takes into account things like whether it's going into an environment that's going to be denied, whether it's an environment where we might lose communications with the device.
Okay.
And if that's the case, both of those things increase the risk pretty dramatically. But at the same time, the Defense Department's interested in using ChatGPT to write personnel reviews and things like that are not lethal decisions, and they're not going to directly lead to someone's death or injury. There's all kinds of benign things. I mean, they run on Excel and Word and Gmail. I mean, it's also a bureaucracy at the end of the day. And a lot of the AI that they're implementing are the good old-fashioned enterprise use cases for AI that much of the rest of the world is thinking about too. So the system is supposed to be able to reliably and quickly and for principled reasons distinguish between the riskier and the less risky species of AI that they might be implementing.
Is there one thing that you believe should just not be invented, even if we could invent it? Are there things you think we should avoid? I know, like with the Manhattan Project, a lot of those physicists wondered if they were doing the morally correct thing in creating the nuclear bomb. Do you feel there are things like that involving AI that we should maybe have, worldwide moratoriums on creating?
Yeah. And the funny sort of ironic coda to that episode is that after the war was over, a lot of the physicists working on the Manhattan Project thought, okay, well, that's it. Like, we're just going to pack this up, right? And just dismantle all of this research and manufacturing capacity because we made the bomb. The war's over. That's why we were doing this.
Yeah.
And no, quite the opposite, right? The technology took on an inertia and it swelled until we had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons holding the whole world hostage. So from the point of view of an individual engineer, you have to be very careful what could be done with your work after you're done working on it and how it might take on a life of its own. Things that I think should never be built. The kind of Terminator scenario, the kind of machine where you might just feed it, a picture of a person and their general location and have it go attack them. I mean, that seems pretty horrifying. I'm not comfortable with that right now. I even feel silly adding that caveat. Like, maybe one day I'll warm up to it. Like, again, I've been in search of an argument for why these systems are problematic, and it's hard to find one. At the end of the day, I think it comes down to trust and transparency and governability. Are these things really going to do what we expect them to do? Will they make mistakes? Do we want to live in a kind of radically unstable world where you can target lethal, totally unaccountable violence from thousands of miles away?
Yeah.
And, never even have to get close to someone? I mean, that's a terrifying kind of prospect.
Yeah, it really is. Do you think eventually, let's say robots, that they can make moral decisions?
I think, that's kind of like asking whether a robot can write poetry or draw a painting. And I think these questions have been answered, practically speaking, in the last couple of years. When I give talks sometime, I show that painting that won the competition, and it was a statewide art competition in Colorado
Yes.
a couple of years ago. beautiful painting. It's got this great like space opera kind of feel to it. It looks like something out of Fifth Element or Dune or something like that. It's a pretty neat painting. And that that episode basically settles the question, right? Here's a machine that made a piece of art that human judges blindly judged was better than the human entrance. So in that sense, yeah, the machine can make art just fine. And yeah, the machine can write a limerick, just fine. You can push one step deeper and say, yeah, but is that really art, or is that
Right.
really poetry? And I appreciate both sides of that question. And I think that I'm not sure that answering one will answer the other, right? There's no painting or no poem that's going to be so beautiful when it's spit out of ChatGPT that it will just convince us that it really does understand the human experience or really knows what it's like to have its heart broken or whatever,
Right.
like Byron does, Um, but on the other hand, does it matter if it's good enough? So you can imagine a machine that perfectly imitates or perfectly aligns with human moral reasoning and moral judgment to the point where it matches our our most revered sages when it comes to morality. And then we could ask, well, yes, but does it really understand? Well, um, no. And I would say no in the sense that a clock doesn't understand what time it is, but it can still get the answer right.
But on the other hand, I mean, is bio I have a question in here for you. Does consciousness require biology or just complexity? And but I think that is a more subtle question, because is biology just complexity? So am I actually n- is there a difference between those two things fundamentally? So beyond biology versus complexity, is biology just complexity? So complexity is what's driving AI, and eventually we are going to have things that have, moral compasses and feelings like we have.
It's true that biological systems are often complex, but complexity doesn't align perfectly with intelligence, for example, or intelligent behavior, nor does it align with other. There's some metrics of measuring the complexity of an organism that are very surprising. So there's some species of mushrooms that have, a much more complicated DNA sequence than we have. Well,
Mm.
Yes,
so
I've heard of
clearly
that.
it's not just, how much DNA you have that determines whether you're complex, even though you might think so at first glance. Um, on the other hand, sometimes we think that simplicity is the mark of intelligence. And some people say this about God. What would make God a special kind of being is that God is divinely simple. God has no parts, and that's one reason why that's one facet of God's awesomeness. Um, when it comes to consciousness and complexity, I mean, the human brain, people have said, is the most complex object in the universe, at least the most complex object that we've discovered. It also, perhaps coincidentally, is the object that seems to give rise to consciousness. But I wouldn't want to say that any sufficiently complex machine or any sufficiently complex arrangement of parts is going to be conscious. I wouldn't want to say that any sufficiently complex machine is going to have the kind of experience that I have. And this is
Mm.
where I'm going to be stepping on the toes of some folks that work in philosophy of mind. But it seems to me that there's something that it's like to be me, a human being. There's a taste and smell and color and so on. There's the experience of encountering all of those things in the world. It's hard for me to believe that um, a computer could replicate that kind of experience, which some people seem to suggest. There's a very strong narrative thread in the artificial intelligence community that says, well, at the end of the day, human beings are just really complicated machines too. And I think that's far too naive. I was at a conference one time giving a presentation, and someone said, well, consciousness is the ability to reflect on yourself. It's the awareness of yourself. That sounds like something John Locke said a couple hundred years ago.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they pointed out, or maybe I gave this as a counterexample. I can't remember if this is part of their view or if this was a counterexample I gave. My phone can tell me what its battery level is. Does that mean my phone has a degree of consciousness? And they said yes. And I would say no.
No. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
if we're even on the same scale, that when my phone reports its battery level, it's doing something like what I do when I take a bite of a pizza. Like, no,
Mhm.
absolutely not.
With our remaining time, because autonomous cars is a huge
Yes.
part of what you talk about, could we maybe go down, hey, a little bit of a pun, could we go down that road?
Yeah. How about go
A
down
bit.
memory
Yeah.
lane, if we will? Yeah.
Yes. And could you maybe talk about some of the philosophical issues surrounding autonomous cars? Because I don't think people, including myself, really thought of it as a philosophical issue until I started reading some of the stuff you were saying.
Yeah, totally. I love these. It's a great microcosm of philosophy of technology and ethics. I mean, there's so many questions that we could ask about autonomous cars. And so I studied. This was one of the first technologies that I studied when I came here to Cal Poly. There was an NSF grant that I got attached to, so I studied autonomous cars and rode on those for 6 or 7 years. Um, if I could give maybe one example, I mean, I can give, obviously, I could rattle off plenty, but I'm trying to think of, one example that might be my favorite example. I'll give you two. So one is an example of what we can call environmental justice. So autonomous cars are supposed to bring a lot of benefits. They also
Mm.
generate a lot of problems or a lot of harm too. And one question that we have to ask anytime we're talking about benefits and harms is how those get distributed throughout society. Who
Mm.
gets to benefit? Who bears the risks?
Yeah.
And too often, the story is a familiar one, that the people that benefit are those that are already wealthy, comfortable, powerful, and those that are harmed, those that shoulder a disproportionate amount of the harm, are the disempowered, the poor, the marginalized communities. And we see plenty of reason to be worried about this with autonomous cars. They pop up in fancy cities like San Francisco and LA. And meanwhile, at night when they all go back to charge, they all charge in a neighborhood where you have access to high tension power lines or like high frequency power lines, um, and where land is cheap and where land is near a highway because you want to get all the cars on the road quickly. That's where you want to set up a charging station. Just makes kind of economic sense. Oh,
Interesting.
those are also the poor and minority neighborhoods. Whoops. So we have
Well,
this kind of
whoops.
confluence of things that happen, and because of the world that we inherit is a world that's not perfectly just. When we follow our economic rationality within that world, we often end up making those problems worse. So
Mm.
there's reason to think that autonomous cars would create new kinds of burdens for already marginalized communities in terms of pollution, in terms of road wear and tear, in terms of noises for when the cars are booting up in the morning. They all turn on at 6 a.m. and now everyone within a block can hear all these cars turning on. Um, and meanwhile, the people in the cities get to enjoy, a slightly cheaper taxi ride. They don't have to
Right.
interact with any other human being, which I think is a big driver and a lot of technological advance that we're seeing. And they don't have to deal with the externalities of those robots because they go park somewhere else at the end of the day. And so it's, you have this very familiar story where some people benefit first and most, and other people are being harmed by it. I mean, that's one case of distributive justice. Um, I'll give you another case of privacy, which is pretty interesting. So the driverless cars that we see nowadays are covered in cameras. I think a Tesla has something like a dozen cameras on it. Elon Musk
Mhm.
once spouted off that, a car has a dozen cameras and human beings only have two eyes. Therefore, a car is a better driver than a human.
Uh-huh.
Like, I think I didn't even have to pick that up. I'm just going to let that there. I'm going to let it advertise its own foolishness.
Yeah.
So, but what that means is that these cars are always capturing lots and lots of data. And you might say, well, they're driving public streets. This is just, you don't have an expectation of privacy when you're in public. A lot of people are still stuck in that kind of mind frame, which I think is also very naive. If
Hmm.
I see you walking down the street and I remember that you're wearing a black shirt today, okay, fine. Maybe I haven't violated your privacy. If I follow you every second of the day, anytime you're outside, and I write down where you went and I write down what you purchased, or if you came out of the store with a receipt, or what you're wearing, or, you know, then I am violating your privacy, even though all I've done is the first thing several thousand times. So
Yeah.
we need to again get away from this idea, disabuse ourselves of this idea that well, things that happen in public are not you don't have any expectation that those will be kept private.
Mm.
So the cars are collecting hundreds or thousands, millions of hours of public
Data.
streets,
Wow.
and that data is lucrative. And it's also going to be in demand for the usual suspects, the police, the military, nowadays, immigration enforcement. I mean, all of those people are going to say,
Uh-huh.
yeah, we have a
Mm.
business in knowing walking down the streets. Maybe there's a wanted criminal with a warrant out. Maybe there was a crime that took place right before your car drove by. And so we're going
Yeah.
to subpoena the
Oh,
footage from
you're
the car.
right.
Uh-huh.
That has already happened. So you can
Uh,
see, you're creating an attractive nuisance when you collect all this data, and you're raising really threatening questions about people's privacy. And again,
That's a good point.
all of this is glossed over when you think, well, an autonomous car is just a better taxi, in the same way that a light bulb is just a better candle,
I
right?
thought
Right.
about this stuff a little
Yeah.
bit when the meteor in Russia um, came down, and it was captured by all of these cameras mounted in the cars because I guess in Russia, a traffic accident can become a very big deal, and so they want to protect themselves. And so they install these dash cams, and that was the first moment I was like, yes, they captured a meteor, but what else are they capturing? You
Yeah.
know?
Mm.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So the
That's
dash
true.
cams, I think dash cams often have a buffer of, I don't know, 30 seconds or a minute or something like that. And the idea is, if there's an accident, I'll press the button to save that file. But otherwise, I don't really need, hours and hours of myself driving around on roads. That's pretty dull footage.
Yeah.
But if you're training a model to detect objects to avoid accidents, if you are, um, if you're taking footage of downtown streets that could be lucrative for whatever reasons, for real estate, for trends in this industry or that one, um, in public safety information for police officers, then the law might compel you to save that data in case the police
Yeah.
come asking for it. You see this on ChatGPT, right? You open up
Yeah.
a private conversation and it says, yeah, this conversation is private, but just so you know, we're going to keep it for 30 days just in case anything happens. So it's
Yeah.
private, but not really private.
Right. Right.
So the, do one of the, I think, continuing themes of the information age is forcing us to re-examine our assumptions about privacy, what it is, why it matters, who gets to decide, what data are collected and who keeps them and what are they used for. These are questions we still don't have answers to because people are really glib when they think that there's a public sphere and a private sphere, and if you accept the terms of service, you've waived all your rights to privacy. I mean, people still have positions that are very naive on this stuff, and I think it's because confronting the reality is daunting.
Yeah, and I also think like just could say most people don't think about it, and just in general, it's like it's just there. You don't study in this. You just like, oh, this is great. Oh, look, it's a self-driving car, and I can sit in it and make do my makeup, and I get to work. But I was listening to one of your TED talks, and it was something that made me really think. I never saw it like this before, and about the self-driving cars, like who does it benefit? Like if there is an accident, and what and I never thought about like if it breaks, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? It should maybe speed up. It should have, and I can you just a little bit talk about that because that
Sure.
really for me, I'm like, oh, I never thought of this with the self-driving cars.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled about the trolley problem, which goes back to the early 70s, I think, or maybe the late 60s in philosophy. And this is the classic, there's the trolley's headed down the track. There's 5 people on the track. You can flip a switch so it goes onto a side track where there's only one person. And sometime around the late 2000s, people realized, and I think my colleague here at Cal Poly, Patrick Lynn, was one of the first people to publicize this, that the trolley problem serves as a worthwhile analogy for autonomous cars. Not because they're going to be making decisions quite like that, but because they are going to be making decisions about how to distribute risk on the road. And even decisions as basic as if there's a biker, I'm on an undivided highway
Mm,
there's traffic going 2 directions, and on the right there's a biker, and on the left there's oncoming traffic. How does the car split the difference between the oncoming traffic and the biker? That becomes a question of how much risk it's subjecting its occupant to versus the vulnerable road user, the biker on the shoulder.
hmm
Another example that you gave is about, yeah, again, apportioning risk between the people inside the car and outside. So I was on the bus in grad school one day when someone, crossed the street where they weren't supposed to, and the bus driver slammed on the brakes, and those things have good brakes.
hmm
And everyone inside the bus lurches forward, and a person sitting next to me hit his head on one of these, poles that you hold onto when you're on the bus. Um, and it hit his head pretty hard, it seemed. And the bus driver said, "Oh, I'm sorry. There was someone in front of the bus. I had to stop the bus." And just that example there led me to wonder, if the bus had been full of 30 people, was that the right thing to do? As the
Yeah.
bus driver,
Right.
you obviously want to minimize harm to people outside the bus, but imagine that like 10 people had gotten traumatic brain injuries, concussions from
Yeah.
slamming on the brakes.
Yes.
Then it's not unreasonable to say, maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. And that's
Right.
just a question of who bears the risk, the people inside the vehicle or outside. And so even questions about how hard you brake are morally loaded questions.
Right.
And maybe we could finish up with a question that I think relates to what you just said and what you and Caroline were discussing, which is what is the real danger of AI? Is it AI or the people who make AI?
Good
Well,
one.
yeah. I mean, there's Shannon Valler's a great author in technology ethics and technology criticism, and she's compared AI to a mirror. And she says that we're all like Narcissus now, falling in love with our reflection, that the AI can reflect back to us exactly what we want, and it does such a good job of engaging with us and ensnaring us. So I think that question, at the end of the day, there's a lot more overlap, I think, between the people that make the systems and the systems themselves and how they perform. So
Oh,
that question's
okay.
kind of hard to disentangle. If AI goes wildly awry off the rails, then I think the natural thing to do is to scrutinize the people that made it. So there's a very
Yeah.
close connection between those two things. I think the greatest danger of AI is um, the sort of the boring dangers that we hear about with technology development all the time. So who's going to benefit? Who's going to be left behind? What
Yeah.
kind of gaps in society are going to be exacerbated? Wealth gap and income and so on. Are we going to be able to catch the mistakes that AI makes, whether they're silly, like, a typo in the Python code that it's writing for me, or whether they're really significant, like if there's an analysis written by ChatGPT that's placed on the president's desk that gets something wrong? I mean, that
Mm,
these are real kinds of issues that we should worry about. Meanwhile, there's ungodly amounts of wealth being poured into these systems,
yeah.
and the expectation of trillion-dollar rewards. And so I think there's a big question for society about if those productivity gains really do materialize, how are we going to distribute those benefits? And how can we use this amazing innovation, supposed to be another industrial revolution? It's supposed to be another watershed event in the history of economic systems to have AI that can perform like this. We have a choice as a society about what kinds of problems we're going to have it tackle. Or are we going to just deploy it, to make the people that are already fantastically wealthy 1% more wealthy? And these are hard questions to address, but I think those are the questions that I would like to see getting more traction, more attention, and a louder voice. Not the sort of AI is going to kill us all in our sleep one day because it becomes conscious. Like those kinds of things, I think are a distraction. And I think that there are much more mundane but much more pressing issues with AI now.
Beautifully said.
And those are very important questions that we need to ask and talk about. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just to add just one more little piece to that, the people compare it to the Industrial Revolution, but if you look at the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution, they were terrible for many, many, many people.
Yeah.
And you have, children getting their arms ripped off in fabric mills and with absolutely no protections for workers. And you have smog that just chokes communities until they all have black lung. I mean, this kind of stuff. And it's just way too quick to look at the chart of life expectancy and say, oh, well, I guess the Industrial Revolution was an unvarnished success. I mean, it's just insane and irresponsible to tell that story, that history of technology that way. And I think we could learn a lot by studying previous disruptions and thinking now about how to guard against their worst impacts.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And I think our viewers are going to get a lot out of this episode. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Happy to be here. They're great conversations. So thanks for having me.
Okay.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching or listening to The Internet is Crack. Tune in next week when we have another great conversation about robotics, AI, and the internet. You can watch us or listen to us on YouTube or Spotify or many other outlets. And don't forget to follow us on social media. See you next Monday.